About 2 years ago, I decided to stay with my father during his work shift. He was a night watchman at a funeral home, and that night, around 10:30 p.m., we arrived at the place. Everything seemed calm. The funeral home was large and almost deserted, as always, with the silence only interrupted by the sound of the dog that guarded the place. The dim lights of the corridors cast long, distorted shadows, creating an atmosphere of mystery and melancholy. We settled in a small office near the main entrance. My father, as usual, began to review some papers while I tried to make myself comfortable on the old sofa that was there. There was a sensation in the air, a kind of weight that seemed unique to funeral homes. The smell of wax and dried flowers filled the air, accentuating the sense of isolation and stillness. The wind outside made the trees whisper softly, adding a touch of unease to the already eerie atmosphere. Minutes passed slowly. From my spot on the sofa, I could see my father moving meticulously, checking documents and ensuring everything was in order. The radio, playing at a low volume, emitted a soft melody that contrasted with the tension I was beginning to feel in the air. Occasionally, my father would get up and walk through the hallways, making sure everything was calm. Around midnight, a subtle noise woke me up. I didn't pay much attention. I thought it was the dog or some common noise in the building. I closed my eyes and tried to go back to sleep. However, shortly after, the same noise woke me up again, louder this time, as if someone were dragging something heavy across the floor. The feeling of unease started to take hold of me. "Dad, what was that?" I asked as I sat up in bed. He was sitting nearby, talking to his boss on the phone. The dog, lying by his side, didn't seem to react. My curiosity, fueled by the silence and darkness of the place, urged me to get up. My father gave me a worried look but gestured for me to stay calm. However, my curiosity was stronger. I decided to explore. The funeral home was a labyrinth of dark hallways and rooms, but at the end of the building, there was a small grassy courtyard. It was completely dark, and I didn't know how to turn on the lights. I decided to use my phone's light. The weak glow of the screen illuminated the corner of the yard, where I saw someone standing. A tall, slender figure seemed to be waiting for me. At first, I thought it was my father, but when I called out to him, I got no response. Hesitant, I approached the figure, which remained motionless. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The figure wasn't my father. The man was dressed in dark clothes, but something about his posture, something in his gaze, made me feel he wasn't a friendly presence. The tension in the air was palpable, and the silence grew denser with each step I took. I felt sweat beginning to run down my forehead, each drop marking the growing anxiety that was gripping me. When I was just a few steps away from him, the man slowly turned towards me. The face of that figure was expressionless, almost empty. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. A shiver ran down my spine as I noticed the dog, which had been calm until then, began to growl softly, as if sensing something abnormal as well. He looked at me fixedly, as if he had been expecting me, and replied calmly, "I'm another night watchman, your father's colleague." His voice was deep and slow, almost like an echo reverberating in the darkness. I felt a mix of relief and confusion. Why hadn't I seen him before? What was he doing there in the middle of the night? Confused and fearful, I couldn't utter another word. But at that precise moment, I heard my father calling my name from the end of the hallway. "Isabella, we have to go now." I turned towards him, and when I looked back at the man, he was gone. The figure had vanished into the darkness as if he had never been there. The dog, for its part, stopped growling and remained quiet, watching the spot where the man had stood. My heart was pounding as I ran towards my father. We quickly left the funeral home, but I didn't tell him what I had seen that night. I wasn't ready to share my fear. The drive home was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts. The image of that man remained etched in my mind. Days went by, and the unease didn't leave me. Nights turned into a torment, filled with nightmares and visions of the man in the darkness. I decided to investigate a bit more about the history of the funeral home. There were rumors, stories told by former employees and neighbors about apparitions and strange events. Some said the funeral home was cursed, that those who died there didn't find peace. Finally, a week after that night, while we were talking, I decided to tell my father what had happened. We sat in the kitchen, illuminated only by the dim light of a lamp. My father turned pale upon hearing my story. After a few seconds of silence, he looked at me fixedly and, in a low voice, said, "That night, it was just you and me there. Remember I was talking on the phone, right? My boss told me to leave as soon as possible. The man you saw was a night watchman, yes, but he was murdered there over 10 years ago." His voice broke at the end, and his eyes reflected a mixture of fear and sadness. A chill ran down my spine. What I had seen that night wasn't a hallucination or a mistake. The man I had encountered in the darkness was someone who had died there long before I arrived. From that day on, nights at the funeral home were never the same for me. The presence of that man accompanied me, invisible but tangible, in every corner of the place. And I understood that some mysteries should never be unearthed. The weeks following the revelation were difficult. Every time I returned to the funeral home with my father, I felt the eyes of that figure following my every move. The shadows seemed darker, and the noises more threatening. My father also changed. His demeanor became more serious, and although he didn't say it, I knew he also felt the presence. One night, while my father was doing his usual rounds, I decided to talk to some of the former employees who had worked at the funeral home. One of the elderly women, who had been there for over 20 years, told me the story of the night watchman. "He was a good man," she said, "always attentive and careful. But one night, they found his body in the yard. They never knew who did it or why. Since then, some say his spirit still roams the place, watching." The old woman's story only reinforced my fear. Every corner of the funeral home seemed to tell me something, an untold story, a silent lament. And although my father tried to keep the place safe, I knew he wasn't alone in his vigil. The spirit of the night watchman was still there, guarding his own secret in an eternal night shift. As the months went by, I became more accustomed to the unsettling presence. Yet, there were moments when the atmosphere grew too heavy to bear. On such nights, the air seemed thicker, each creak of the floorboards louder, and the flicker of the lights more erratic. I started bringing a small notebook with me, jotting down every odd occurrence, every shadow that moved out of place, and every whisper carried by the wind. One particularly stormy night, the power went out. My father and I were in the middle of our dinner break when the lights suddenly vanished, plunging us into complete darkness. The rain pounded against the windows, and the wind howled like a tormented spirit. We scrambled to find candles and flashlights, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. In the dim light, I saw a shadow move swiftly down the hallway. I grabbed my father's arm, my voice barely a whisper. "Did you see that?" He nodded, his expression grave. We cautiously followed the shadow, the dog leading the way with its ears perked up and a low growl emanating from its throat. We reached the end of the hallway, where the shadow had disappeared. My father shone the flashlight around, revealing an old, dusty door that I had never noticed before. It led to a basement, a place that even the oldest employees rarely talked about. Taking a deep breath, my father opened the door, the hinges creaking loudly in the oppressive silence. The basement was damp and cold, filled with cobwebs and old furniture covered in white sheets. We carefully descended the stairs, the flashlight beam dancing across the room. In one corner, we found an old journal, its pages yellowed with age. My father carefully opened it, and we began to read. The journal belonged to the murdered night watchman. His entries were filled with observations about the funeral home, but also with notes about strange occurrences and eerie feelings he had experienced during his shifts. The last entry sent chills down my spine. "I feel like I'm being watched. There's a presence here, something dark and malevolent. If something happens to me, know that it was not of this world." As we read the journal, the temperature in the basement seemed to drop further. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and when I turned around, I saw the figure of the night watchman standing at the bottom of the stairs, watching us. His